Welcome to Radiant Midweek. Here we go. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was the day after Christmas in 2004, and suddenly the news erupted. An earthquake had occurred in the Indian Ocean, and there were concerns of a tsunami. And sure enough, not too long after, a massive tsunami with waves up to 30 meters, that's 100 feet high, devastated communities on the surrounding coasts of the Indian Ocean. And in the aftermath, it was estimated that 228,000 people had died in 14 different countries. In fact, it remains the deadliest natural disaster in the 21st century to this day. Sometimes the question gets asked, are there more earthquakes today than there have been in previous years? I'll hear of this in prophecy circles, that earthquakes are increasing. But are they increasing? And when we talk about increasing, we mean both in frequency and intensity. And I know it may seem like it, but as we go through some of this data, the answer is going to be not necessarily. We've seen a dramatic improvement, however, in the quality of the equipment that is used to record seismic activity, and therefore it can seem like maybe that activity is increasing. But facts are a funny thing, and you can make data say whatever you want them to say sometimes, including that there's more earthquakes, but that isn't necessarily the truth. Earthquake activity actually hasn't increased as much as many think. The Comcat Earthquake Catalog, it contains an increasing number of earthquakes in recent years. However, not because, as we talked about, that there is more earthquakes, but rather the seismic instruments available are more sensitive. There's more of them out there on the planet, and therefore they're recording more of them. And the National Earthquake Information Center says it locates about 20,000 earthquakes each year around the globe. That amounts to about 55 per day. I had no idea. And our ability, though, to communicate globally has also increased. So when an earthquake happens in another part of the world, they can share that with scientists throughout the rest of the world. And as a result, these improvements in communications and equipment and availability all point to the fact that it's not that we have more earthquakes, it's just that we're more able to detect them sooner, and share that information with others. It can seem like there's more, but that's not necessarily true. Because according to long-term records, and we're talking here since 1900, we expect about 16 major earthquakes on any given year. That's the average, and that includes 15 of those being in the magnitude range of 7 or more. One earthquake, on average, being magnitude 8 or greater. In the past 40 to 50 years, the records show that there were years that we exceeded this average number, and there were years that we didn't. In fact, the year with the largest total in the last, call it 123, 24 years, was 2010. There were 23 major earthquakes. And I remember when that happened that year, because combined with things like 2004 or some of the other activities, in 2001, of course, we had the Twin Towers that came down. It just seemed like the world was out of control at this time, and prophecy experts were going crazy all over the place. This is the signs of the ends of the times. We're living in those times. But what we end up finding out is actually, yes, that was a unique year with 23 major earthquakes, but it has not been that way since. In fact, there were some years we were below average. In 1989, for instance, we only had 6 major earthquakes, and in 1988, we only had 7. And so again, one of the biggest claims by some of the end times teachers is that the earthquake frequency and intensity has been on the rise. This is a sign of the end of the times. But this isn't necessarily true. The facts and the data don't support the supposition. We're not necessarily agreeing with this in Scripture. In fact, Mark Benthian from Southern California Earthquake Center, he said the chances of an earthquake somewhere around the world are 100% every single day. So you can see, it's not necessarily true that they're on the rise. Thorne Lay from the University of California said, if we look at all the earthquake magnitudes in the past 10 years, is not unusual in terms of the rate of events. The rate increases just seen for events with magnitudes larger than 7.5 or so, he said. This suggests that great events were catching up on the plate boundary motions in several regions with fortuitous similar timing. So again, some years are down, some years are up, but we have not seen a large increase over the last few years. Another big one that people ask is wars, and does that seem like that's on the increase and rise here in recent years? But what's interesting, in 2003, the New York Times ran an article asking this question: how many years of peace has there been in recorded history? And as they did their research, they determined that humans have only been entirely at peace for 268 years out of the last 3,400. Did you catch that? Only 268 years out of the past 3,400 years. That's about 8% of the 5,000 years of recorded human history. How about the United States? Well, since its birth, the U.S. has only had 17 years of peace. The country has been at war 93% of its existence. Since 1946, the U.S. has been directly involved in more than 117 partisan electoral interventions over the past 20 years, dropping an average of more than 40 bombs a day. That's staggering. Statistics show that over the past 2 decades, the anti-terror wars have cost us around the globe more than 929,000 lives. You may or may not realize it, but there's a list, I'll put it on the screen, of the current wars and rebellions the U.S. is involved in. For instance, Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is with the Houthi. There's the U.S. intervention in the Syria civil war. There's the U.S. military intervention in Niger, the second U.S. intervention in the Somali civil war, and the U.S. intervention in Yemen. Yet, how many times do we turn on the news and we really don't hear anything about these going on? And yet we're actively involved with them as a country throughout the world. Another one, how about famines? People said that's a sign of the end of times, aren't they? And is that increasing? And the answer is yes. Right now, actually, there is a global food crisis. It is the largest one since the UN World Food Program was created in 1963. And frankly, since we've recorded things, never has hunger reached such devastating heights. There is nearly 350 million people around the world experiencing extreme forms of hunger right now. And there's various reasons this is happening and is causing this food crisis, one of which we just talked about: conflict. Many point towards the climate crisis and just the rising costs of driving the food are driving the food crisis and making it even worse. In other words, inflation. And so conflict being the number one cause is the biggest problem. This destroys roads and buildings. It forces people out of their homes. It, again, drives up inflation as well, cuts people's access off to markets. And that's why we see such hunger throughout the world. And so our latest research shows that there's 735 million people currently facing hunger. Compared to 2019, which was 613 million, there's been a noticeable increase. And so over 122 million more people are facing hunger since 2019. This is, in fact, on the rise. Why do I bring all these up? Well, let's go back to Matthew 24, because remember, the disciples asked Jesus 3 questions, and he begins answering them. In Matthew 24, verse 6, it says, "You will hear of wars and rumor of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of these are the beginning of birth pains." And so we'll do what we do. Let's break down this verse a little bit and compare it to some of the information we just talked about it to find out what Jesus is trying to tell his disciples here. The first thing he says to them is, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it you're not alarmed. And we talked a little bit about war here a bit ago. As I think about it, I was born at the tail end of the Vietnam War, and can remember Russia was in Afghanistan not too long after that. In the 1980s, I remember things like the Falkland Wars. Thinking back as I went off to college, I remember sitting there watching on TV as the Gulf War ignited. I remember Saddam Hussein called it the mother of all wars. And what I remember most is dozens of people within the next week were suddenly gone. They were all college students who were paying for college through their military service, never expected they were going to actually be called up, and all of them suddenly were. I've watched the Twin Towers fall. I remember the Bosnian Wars and the UN involvement in that, the genocide in Somalia and the pain of that, the rebellion in Syria. And then suddenly America is in Afghanistan, and that was a long war that only recently was ended. We went back to Iraq again under Bush #2. Recently we've seen the Ukraine war with Russia fire up, the Israel conflict. Also, Yemen is now in the mix as they are backed by Iran. And there's ISIS is involved not only, for instance, with the Israel war, but throughout that region. And these are just to name a few. We could go on and on. And as we noted earlier, there seems that, or at least in my life, it seems like we're constantly at war, and this is just a part of our lives. But notice what Jesus says. He says, such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Which gets us to a big question today. What happens when you're looking for the wrong signs? You know what I mean? You're off looking for the wrong things, thinking that they're pointing to something you're aiming at, but come to find out that's not actually the right things. You were looking at the wrong signs, which led you to wrong thinking. Because every time a major event happens, whether it's an earthquake, it's a war, somebody claims that this is a sign of the end. The recent one, the Israeli conflict, that had many Christians up in arms. This is it. The end is coming. We're living those times. But is that a sign of the end? And I would remind folks that conflicts in Israel have been going on since it was founded in 1948. In fact, on the screen here, I'll give you a screenshot of all the wars they've been involved in. Israel has been in a constant state of war readiness since they became a nation in 1948. And again, these things overall have been happening for thousands of years. And so what Jesus is saying is like, these aren't necessarily the big signs to be looking for. And sometimes we go looking for signs that aren't actually signs. The increased frequency of these may be signs we're approaching this period, but not necessarily signs of the end times. And that can be hard to gauge since wars, famines, earthquakes, even persecution has been going on throughout the world for the past 2,000 years. These aren't necessarily the signs of the end. They're just signs of what has been part of the human condition since sin entered the world for thousands of years. Paul Hebert, he says this, instead of giving them the sign they requested, Jesus began by alerting them to false signs. And I want to look at the other synoptic gospels as well in comparison to what they have to say. In Luke 21, for instance, says, when you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. In Mark 13:7, he says, when you hear of wars and rumor of wars, do not be frightened. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. And so we see here another part of breaking down the verse, you will hear. The literal Greek translation means continually hear. In other words, over time, centuries, thousands of years, you will hear of wars and earthquakes and pestilences and all kinds of bad things. These things are going to happen and they will always be going on. And he'll say there are wars and rumors of wars. However, again, wars and rumor are not specific to the end. They've been going on for centuries. And so this is what I call the second false basis for believing the end is at hand. The first one we talked about in the last podcast, which is there will be false messiahs, false teachers. The second one then is there will be a misunderstanding of the interpretation of wars. People will see them as the end of times. However, we should take note. Yes, in the end, there will be a false Messiah. Yes, the world will be amazed by this person's military prowess. They'll even ask, can they be stopped? There will be a powerful empire that exists. Current wars, dictators, and skirmishes, though, don't always mean the end of times. And so we go looking for signs that aren't actually there. And then, as we break the verse down further, it says, see that you are not frightened. Wars and rumors of wars are frightening, to be sure. Every one of us, every time a war breaks out, there's a fear, there's an anxiety to that for many different reasons. I mean, I just think of what happened when the war in Israel broke out here recently. I mean, your first question is like, yes, how far is this going to spread? What other countries are going to be involved in this? Will we be able to contain it? Is Israel going to survive this? All sorts of questions break out during that time. And today, I mean, even just watching the news, we see missiles that are being fired at U.S. ships. In the past century or more, we've just seen 2 world wars that accounted for millions upon millions of lives. And these sort of things, they frighten, and they continue to frighten people for good reason. But consistently, I am reminded from Scripture, we're not called to live in fear. 1 Peter 5:7 says, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. As we continue breaking down the verse, he goes, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. And so these are the natural result, unfortunately, of our broken human nature and our sinful, selfish nature. We are in conflict with each other. Even nature is out of balance because of this. And so all of these are really signs of the brokenness of humankind and this fallen world that we live in. We are separated from God and ruled by self-interest. This affects not only us, our relationship with others, but also the earth itself. As we break down further, it says, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And to fully wrap around this, I want to go back to the other synoptic gospels too. In Luke 21, verse 10, it says, then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. Mark 13 says, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. Now, a couple things I want to look at real quick here. When it calls nations and nations, the Greek word there is ethnos. It's where we get our modern word ethnic from. So when it talks about nations rising against nations, a literal translation of this is ethnic groups will rise against other ethnic groups. In many ways, this is discrimination. Oftentimes, this can lead to genocide, or it's one religion against another religion. It's racism based upon color of skin. Other things, terrible things we see happen in the news, we call ethnic cleansing. All of things kind of relate to ethnics will rise against ethnics, or nations will rise against nations, is literally what it's saying here. Kingdom, on the other hand, is bacilli, and this is more traditionally what we might think of as a modern nation. So in the first one where it says ethnic will rise against ethnic, in this one it is literally kingdom will rise against kingdom, or government will rise against other governments. And this can represent even the picture of world war, which we have seen in the last 100 years. Many nations rising against each other at once. There will be famines is another one as we break down the verse, and earthquakes in various places. And we've talked about famines already. They're not uncommon and have not been uncommon in the past 2,000 years. We'll see this even come up several times in Revelation, for instance, in seals 3 and 4, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. We'll see inflation and the rising cost of food. We'll see famine compared to other plagues, where it will affect a quarter of the earth, or even the death of the quarter of the earth. We'll study that more when we're in Revelation. And there's a chart we're going to look at here in just a moment. In chapter 18 of Revelation, it talks about Mystery Babylon. And again, famine is listed, pestilence is listed there as well. It says Babylon is burned up. And yes, by the way, those chapter 17 and 18 of Revelation is where this podcast gets its name from. So we'll be talking more and more about that as we go along. As we look again at earthquakes, another common theme in the book of Revelation, there's at least 3 earthquakes mentioned. Some say that each of the 3 are distinct. They're separate earthquakes from each other. I don't align with that 100%. I think a couple of them are actually talking about the same earthquake, but we'll get to that later. But we do see earthquakes in the book of Revelation as one of those signs of the end. In fact, we'll look at Revelation chapter 6, verse 12. It talks of a earthquake that in particular that will catch our eye later on. It says, I watched as he opened the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red. The stars in the sky fell to earth. They were like figs that drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. I should note, this is not a small earthquake we're talking about in Revelation here. This one dramatically changes the earth, the topography of the earth. This is an extinction type event that we're talking about here. It causes the sun to turn to black like sackcloth, which means it's not completely blotted out, but it's greatly diminished. And we've seen that a few times in history. We've talked about that on the podcast before, but even just in the past 200 years, in April of 1815, Mount Tambora exploded with a very powerful eruption. It killed tens of thousands of people in Indonesia, but the resulting ash cloud blocked sunlight from the earth, and it changed the global crisis from 2 to 7 degrees for a couple of years. In fact, the following year became known as the year without a summer. It was unusually cold, and wet conditions swept across Europe and North America, greatly affecting, again, what we've talked about, famines. A lot of people died from that event. This happens because dust gets in the particles, they get into the air, and they block the sunlight. What are some of the causes of the sun being diminished and dust particles getting into the air? Well, that's earthquakes. Volcanoes are another one. And then in the last 100 years, we've created a third reason on our own, and that could be nuclear weapons. What we call a nuclear winter can cause the very same thing to happen. So not only natural phenomenon, but we've actually created a man-made one that could also cause this to happen. It's noted as well that dimming can be caused by air pollution too. Now, the next sign we see is that the moon turns red, and this is called a total lunar eclipse. The entire moon falls within the darkest part of the Earth's shadow. This is called the umbra, and when the moon is within the umbra, it turns a reddish hue. You've maybe heard this before. They're called blood moons. There's other reasons, however, the moon can turn red as well. First, similar reasons as we listed above that diminish the light on the sun. Same things that can diminish the sun can cause the moon to turn red. Natural disasters such as volcanoes or a meteor strike or large earthquake or again, a nuclear disaster. Any one of those things can put fine dust particles up into the atmosphere. These are made of different elements, and when the sun is reflected off of them, can cause the moon to turn different colors or look like it's different colors, including red. The next sign we see is stars falling from the sky, and this one is more difficult to nail down exactly. It says it's like figs blown off of a tree, and the imagery you get here is like lights streaking through the sky. They're falling down. Well, what are some ideas? What are some things that might cause this to happen? Well, right away, my mind goes to a meteor shower. Another one might be a comet hitting the Earth. And oftentimes, because comets have a lot of debris, that's what the tail is you see with them, that debris can reach our atmosphere and look like streaks in the sky, things falling down. Meteors aren't always just one rock. They can come in clusters. Another person had an interesting theory. What would it look like if all the satellites suddenly started raining down on the Earth? Could that happen? Yes, they've shown that a severe solar storm could cause something like that to happen. Another theory that we see out there is if the Earth shifts on its axis. In other words, there's a dramatic shift in how the Earth is leaning in space. And they have good evidence to believe this has happened before in the past, the Earth shifting on its axis. This would be accompanied by devastating winds. The stars would look like they are suddenly moving or streaking in the sky, and all sorts of other events. We'll talk about that more later as we get into Revelation as well. But each of these are kind of theories, and it's hard to nail down exactly what's happening here. For now, I'll just let you guess and think through, what do you think is going on in this verse, in this seal, and Revelation? And do keep in mind, and I think we're right too, that John is on earth watching this happen. He's giving this image as a participant on earth, watching these things unfold on earth. And we have a 21st century mindset when we think about it, but he had a first century mindset. And so he's a first century man trying to explain what could be 21st century technology, or we just have a better understanding of things like asteroids, comets, natural phenomenon that they didn't necessarily have in the first century. So keep in mind, he's writing down what he's seeing from a first century perspective. Things like the heavens rolling up. And this isn't the only place we see this in Scripture. In Isaiah 34:4, it says, all the stars in the sky will be dissolved. The heavens rolled up like a scroll, and all the starry host will fall, like withered leaves from the vine, like shriveled figs from the fig tree. So we see very similar description here from what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24, but also the seal in Revelation chapter 6. There is alignment in the Bible about this event. I picture, for instance, a nuclear reaction, and there's like this pressure wave. If you've ever seen, and I couldn't find a good image of this or video for this online, but if you've ever seen a nuclear bomb go off above ground, the clouds and everything kind of separates suddenly, and this is called a pressure wave. It pushes everything to the side, and then the big mushroom cloud appears. And again, we'll explore all these things later on. The last big sign we noticed in here is that every mountain and island is removed from its place. It doesn't say they move. It says removed. And again, this is indicating some enormous tectonic events, some large things happening to the earth and the plates of the earth and so forth. And my main point here, again, this is not a small earthquake. Later in Revelation, if they're talking about the same events, and I believe that they are, it will say that no earthquake like this has ever occurred on earth before. But let's go back to what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24. When he's talking about plagues and earthquakes at this point in the chapter, and he's not referring to the ones necessarily we are seeing in Revelation, and we'll show you why here in a minute. Because plagues have happened regularly for thousands of years. Earthquakes are just part of our lives. Tectonic plates rub against each other. And notice then why Jesus says what he says next. He says, all these are the beginning of birth pains. In other words, they're not the actual signs of the end. They're just warning signs of what is to come. Don't get them confused with the actual thing. Now, I've got 3 kids, and my wife has wonderfully given us 3 children. And one of the things that we went through during that period was something called Braxton Hicks contractions. And I'm sure many women out there know what we're talking about with this. If you've ever had a child, you probably had these. And what do we know about Braxton Hicks contractions? Well, you're not actually in labor, not officially yet, but your body's kind of warming up for the big event. Kind of what Jesus is saying here. Yes, these things that I'm telling about, these earthquakes, these wars, pestilence, they're all indications of the beginning of the end. However, they're not the big event itself. That is coming later. We're just getting warmed up. And don't be fooled, because earthquakes, famines, and plagues happen. Not every earthquake and not every pestilence is a sign of the end of times. Be careful about looking for signs where there are none. And so what I want to do is take a look at each of these 3 passages from Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13. And the experts then compare them to Revelation chapter 6, which we'll get to later, but these are the seals that Jesus is opening. And you will see some similarities here. For instance, it says, many will come in my name. We go back to our previous podcast last week. Many will come in my name claiming I am the Messiah and will deceive many. When we open the first seal in Revelation, it says, I looked and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow and he was given a crown and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. And so a lot of people say that many will come saying, I am the Messiah. This they feel points to the Antichrist. And in seal 1, this rider on the white horse with the bow who's given a crown rides out to conquer bent on conquest, that these are the same people, or they're talking about the same thing here. The next thing we see is wars and rumors of wars. Nations will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And we open seal 2, it says, then another horse came out, it's fiery red, and its rider was given the power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. So they see an alignment here that there's wars, rumors of wars, nations rising each other, and this fiery red horse going out that will take peace from the earth. We've read that Jesus talks about famines, and we open seals 3 and 4, and it says, I looked and there's a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And when I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wage and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage, but do not damage the oil and the wine. We don't have a lot of time to dig into this, but that is a picture of inflation. People can barely buy with their wages a day's worth of food. We see pestilences from Luke 21. And seal 4, it says, I looked, and before me was a pale horse, and its rider was death, and Hades followed close behind him. And he was given a power over the fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and the wild beasts of the earth. Persecution is another thing we're going to talk more and more about as we go into this chapter, Matthew 24 and Revelation. And we see that listed in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels. But in seal 5, it says, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. We see earthquakes in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels. But in seal 6, it says, there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth. We just talked about this one made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red. It talks about signs in the sky, all 3, again, of the Synoptic Gospels. In seal 6, it says, the sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red. The stars in the sky fell to the earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. And the heavens receded like a scroll rolled up. So for a lot of experts, they see a lot of alignment between the Olivet Discourse in each of the 3 Synoptic Gospels and the seals in Revelation chapter 6. Now, let's get back to me. Do I believe in this correlation? And the answer is I'm not sure. I'm still thinking through this one. I'm not ready to dismiss it 100%. It just doesn't 100% line up as pretty as we'd like to think it does. Keep in mind, at this starting point in Matthew 24, Jesus is warning of false signs, things we shouldn't be looking for. However, in Revelation, these are actual signs that we should be looking for. And we said this time and time again. Yes, there will be earthquakes, and these have happened for thousands of years. But the book of Revelation, it moves an entire landmass. I mean, the topography of the earth is changed on this one. It talks about famines, but this Revelation one is a global famine in this case. And it talks about wars and pestilence. But the Revelation one, as we said already, could possibly wipe out a quarter of the population of the earth. This would be unlike any other pestilence we've ever seen before. And so maybe there's coincidence in this, maybe there's alignment, or maybe not. And so like a lot of things on this podcast, I'm going to present you with the data, and I want you to think it through. Do you see alignment with this? Do you think these 2 things are talking about the same thing, or are they separate from one another? Well, let's land the plane. We've talked about a lot, and I've hit you with a fire hose a little bit today. But the reminder is this. it's human nature, I think. People are constantly looking for signs, and people write books on this. There's all kinds of videos on YouTube predicting certain signs mean certain things and all the things that are going to happen in the next year. Even recently, people are like, okay, so the Pope's decision to bless same-sex people, is that a sign of the end of the times? Or what about Hamas attacking Israel? What about the Ukraine war? Is this Gog and Magog? And we can get lost in these sorts of discussions. But Jesus is warning them one last time that these signs that people often go looking for, they're just the beginning of birth pains. They may not be specific signs of the end. Collectively, altogether, they may be a sign. But Jesus describes this as the beginning of sorrows. In other words, literally the beginning of labor pains. And just as it is true with labor pains, we should expect that the things mentioned, wars, famines, and earthquakes, and so on, should become more frequent and more intense the closer we get to the return of Jesus. However, none of them by themselves is a specific sign of the end. And Jesus is consistently warning his disciples about deception. Don't interpret these normal signs of life, the wars, the rumors of wars, false messiahs, famines, pestilences, earthquakes. They're not necessarily the indication the end times has come. If they are related to the end, then these are just the beginning of sorrows. We're just at the starting line. The much more intense time of delivery is yet to come. And so don't be what I call Christian littles or henny pennies running around crying, the sky is falling, oh my, what a terrible thing, and getting people worried and scared. The signs that are not signs, in other words, are various false messiahs, wars and rumors of wars, famines and earthquakes, persecutions, apostasy, and false prophets. These are things that have happened in the last 2,000 years and will continue to happen. And it can be very easy to look at the news and think that any one of these could be a sign. But the point that Jesus is making here, and the point we need to get our arms wrapped around, is that these incidents will fill our history pages. We will always have these things. And yes, they are painful and awful. And I'm not trying to make light of tragedy. But here we're looking for signs of the end. Jesus likens all of them put together as the beginning of birth pains, but not the actual labor itself. They are not the signs of the end. Again, these things have existed in the disciples' days. They exist today, and they have existed in every age of church history. So do not be fooled. But as we go along in the series, and I'm looking forward to diving in, we're going to discover there are some things to be looking out for, to be watching for. And Jesus constantly reminds us to stay awake, to be watching. And that is what we are called to do as well. But let's not get confused by false signs, and let's be looking for the right things. Thanks for tuning in, and I'm looking forward to diving in next week. We're going to talk a little bit about the apostasy of the church. What happens when it falls? And what does that mean for you and me? I think it's going to be an important conversation, so you don't want to miss this one. Thanks for tuning in. It helps me out a lot if you subscribe, if you like, leave helpful comments. Each of these things open it up for other people to see and extend our reach. Again, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.